Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. In this series of WebLogic performance tuning, we will learn about the end-to-end performance tuning of WebLogic server with respect to multiple resources. So performance tuning is not a specific task which you can say is related with a particular system or particular resource, okay, which you configured in WebLogic. It has a very vast scope. It has a multiple resources when we talk about the configurations of WebLogic server. For example, you have a JVM heap size, and then you have a operating system in which your WebLogic is running. Then you have a database where it connects for the data over the network. Then again, you have a network in between. And then specific in WebLogic, you have a lot of configurations, clusters, data sources, multi-data sources, activity link data sources, JMS resources, and then a lot of configurations are there, right? So it depends what all the resources or what all the kind of configurations that you are using in WebLogic server. Okay, and based on that, you have to do the performance tuning. But yes, you, as I said, there are a lot of components. But when we talk about the practical implementation, then there are 40 to 50% of resources or more than that are common in all the environments. Where, for example, you have a data source for to connect with your database, right? That is configured almost in all environments. So some of the critical components we will cover in this series. And in part one, we are going to cover about the performance tuning of your data source. Now, what is connection pool? The connection pool is the pool of active database connections available for the applications deployed in application server to be used. So we say that a connection pool is a ready-to-use connection, active database connection. So why we said it is ready to use? Because it is already established with the database, tested, and now it is placed in your connection pool as a ready-to-use connection. So whenever your application needed a connection from the database, every time it will not go to database and then to create the connection, to test the connections, okay, which can create a certain kind of a performance problems, okay. So connection pool maintain a ready to use database connections which is already connected with the database and already tested, okay. So when we configure the data source, okay, we define certain parameters, okay. The one parameter is initial capacity and second is maximum capacity, okay. So I'm going to cover the most important parameters that you need to take care when you are configuring your data source or when you are working in the performance tuning, okay. So initial capacity is the number of connections to a database that are created when the JDBC pool is created at server startup. Okay, we all know that when we start the WebLogic server, then all the resources, whether it is a data source, cluster, managed servers, application, they get created or and at the startup of your WebLogic server, right? And then applications are deployed, your connection pools are initiated, your data source are initiated, right? When we start the WebLogic server, so initial capacity is when you start your WebLogic server, and then it during that it start the connection pool. That means it creates the initial number of connections from the database. For example, if I am saying that my initial capacity is 10, okay, so when I will start my WebLogic server, during that time, it will create 10 ready-to-use connections, and then it will place in your connection pool. Okay, and when we talk about maximum capacity of the connection pool, so maximum number of connections which can be configured depend on the maximum number of active connections supported by your database. Okay, so maximum capacity is you can say a constraint in your data source. Okay, that is the capacity till that it can create the number of connections. For example, as I said, I have an initial capacity of 10, okay, and then a maximum capacity of 50, right? So at server startup, when I'm starting my server, it will create only 10 connections, okay. And if during the uses of my application, if 10 connections get occupied and my application need more connection, then it can create some more connections, but till then the maximum capacity, right? So if I have my maximum capacity is 50, that means my that connection pool can create maximum 50 connections, and if any requests come beyond that one, okay, then it will be rejected and you will get see the exceptions in your log file, okay. And that's why this is a very important parameter to configure in your application. You have to do a lot of regression and performance testing of your application to identify the maximum capacity and initial capacity as well, okay. But yes, some monitoring parameters are available in your admin console as well. From there you can see that what is the exact capacity that I need for my uh, data source that we will see in the in next few slides, okay. And then there's a parameter capacity increment, that is the number of connections that are added every time a connection is needed. So for example, as I said, my initial capacity is 10 and then maximum capacity is 50, and if I have defined capacity increment as 5, then if my 10 connections, which is the initial capacity, get occupied, okay, then it will increment the connection by the limit of 5 because I have defined my capacity increment 5. So it will create 5 connections, and if it is all used, that means all 15 connections are used. That, and again it will create 5 connections. That means total I have 20 connections, and if that is used, then again it will going to create 5 connections. Then I would have 25 connections, and it will go till 50 because my maximum capacity of connection pool is only 50. Okay, and this capacity is related with the some parameters of your database. That means the number of sessions or connections that is allowed at the database, right? If your database parameter is not tuned and you are defining your maximum capacity 50, okay, again your requests are going to be rejected because in that case maybe you have defined your maximum pool capacity is 50 and then the connection or session limit in your database are only 40, right? Then there is no meaning of defining 50 here, right? So you have to check for the your database session and connection parameter as well in parallel. And what are the connection and session parameters we will see in the few next slides. Now, what is the recommended approach? The recommended approach is the sizing of pool is set to the initial minimum capacity to the maximum capacity. That means most of the time in more than 90% of environment, we define the initial capacity is equivalent to maximum capacity. That means if I am defining my initial capacity is 50, then my maximum capacity would also be 50. Or in reverse case, you can say if my database connections can allow 100 of connections, and if my requirement for my data source to define the capacity of 100 connections, then I would define maximum capacity as 100 and minimum as well 100. And the reason is that, as I said, the initial connections are created when we start our database, right? And apart from that one, if any more connections are needed, then it get incremented and then it will go up to beyond till my maximum capacity, but that will be created at the runtime. That means if it is getting created at runtime, it will always go to your database and then it will create the connection and then it will hand over to your connection pool. So there could be a performance problem in that case because at runtime when your application need a connection, then it is going to database, creating a connections, and then it is reverting back with the ready to use connection. So that is the reason if we can define the initial capacity as a maximum capacity so that your all the connection will get created when your server will be started. That means all the maximum capacity and all the connections will be are ready to use by the application, right? That will increase your performance. But there are a lot of cases where you have to define the initial capacity bare minimum or maybe zero as well. Okay, but there are very less cases are there, but that is important to understand from the functionality point of view and as well as from the interview point of view. And maybe you will get certain kind of environment where you need to set the initial capacity minimum or maybe equal to zero. Okay, so when Weblogic is booted, the deployment of data sources includes synchronously creating the connection. This is what I'm saying, that when you start your Weblogic server, the initial capacity of number of connections that you have defined, it is created at that time. The more connections that are configured in initial capacity, the longer the boot time is for Weblogic server. Obviously, if you have a large number of connections specifying in your initial capacity, right, then your boot time will get increased because at runtime, when you are booting your Weblogic server, it will reach to your WebLogic and then it will create the connection. So if you have 1,000 number of connections and then it will going to your database, all right, to create 1,000 number of connections at the boot time, definitely your boot time is going to be increased. Related to creating a lot of connections at boot time is the problem of logon storms. The database get too much work at one time. So if you are creating 1,000 of connections and you have 1,000 of connections getting created at the same time from the database when you are starting your WebLogic server, okay, then there could be a problem with your database with a certain number of requests. WebLogic has a solution for that by setting the login delay seconds on the pool, but that also increase the boot time. So you have a parameter to avoid this situation, like, okay, you can define as a login delay. So if you will suppose you are defining the login delay as 5 seconds, that means all the 1,000 connections will not go to your database at the same time, but it will go in a chunk, okay, and in an interval of 5 seconds. So your database will not get overloaded. But again, you are defining the login delay for 5 seconds or 2 seconds or maybe 1 second. That is will add to your booting time of your WebLogic server because that is happening at the boot time of your server. There are a number of cases where it is desirable to set the initial capacity to zero, right? And what is the reason for that one? By doing that, the overhead of creating connections is deferred out of the boot and the database doesn't need to be available. So when you are booting your WebLogic server, many times database may not be available. So if you have initial capacity of zero, okay, that it will not depend on your database. So if that is not available, your server will boot up initially without any problem that time. An application may not want WebLogic to automatically connect to database until it is actually needed. And there are a lot of application which really don't need to be connected to your database at a startup or maybe at the business functionality time as well. Okay, because there is a less dependency on database. There are a lot of static pages and then static contents are there. Those are getting served from the website. But some of the cases are there when it need to connect to database. So why I need to create a lot of connections in my pool if my application need a fewer number of connections at a certain chunk of time in the day? So for that one, I will set my initial capacity 0, and whenever my application need the connection, then it will create a that time. Okay, so these are the points that explain you why at some situations you need the initial capacity as 0 or maybe at the minimum capacity. So there are a number of cases where a minimum capacity should be less than maximum capacity, right? It is almost the same. Connections are generally expensive to keep around. So as I said that connections in the connections pool are ready to use connection. That means that is already connected with your database and ready to use, right? So that means the connection is already established data. That means it is each connection in your data source is taking the certain kind of resources, your heap size, your memory, your CPU utilization, because those are ready to use connections. That means already established connections. That means they are taking the resources. And if you don't need the connection pool, a lot of number connections in the connection pool at a particular time, or maybe you have when you're booting your Weblogic server, okay, then that it takes a lot of resources at that time as well, right? So there could be another aspect of that one. If you are defining the initial capacity equal to maximum capacity, they cause state to be kept on both the client and on the server, and the state on the backend may be heavy. The same is talking about that your load will be heavy on the backend as well, because you have a multiple number of connections already established in your application server data connection. Depending on the vendor, connection users may cost money, right? So depend on the kind of a database version that you are using, the limitations in your database according to the license that you have purchased. If you are continuously keeping the number of connections in your database, but if you are not using that one, that means you are paying extra. That is, you don't need to pay, right? If workload is not constant, then database connections can be freed up by shrinking the pool when connections are not in use. So there is an option for shrinking the pool. That means if you have 1,000 number of connections created in your pool and those are not getting utilized, okay, then you can set a frequency for shrinking the pool, okay, that where your connection pool will automatically shrink the number of connections. Okay, and when using active read link, connections can be created as needed according to runtime load balancing percentages instead of by connection load balancing during data source deployment. So as I explained in my another lecture of active data grid link, it is the advanced version of your data source, which is specifically designed for the rack database. That means cluster database. Okay, in that case, it is, you can say it is an advanced kind of a data source, okay, for which is specifically designed for a lot of features. But one of the features is that it automatically do the load balancing and thus and setting of the parameters of the that is required only at the runtime. For example, I was saying that if I have created the 1,000 number of connections in my data source and I'm actually not using all those, right? But if it is active link data source, okay, it may create 1,000 number of connections, okay, but that is only when it is required. Otherwise, it will automatically tune your data source for the number of desired connections. Now, another parameter is statement cache size. So statement cache size attribute determine the total number of prepared and callable statement to cache for each connection in each instance of the data source. So statement cache size is, you can say, as the name is already explaining, it is a kind of a cache, right, which is used for increasing your performance. When we talk about database, okay, where my application is using the database and the features of my database, right, there, if you talk about, if you know about the database, then you have a PLSQL statements, PLSQL procedures, triggers, and a lot of programs there in database as well. Okay, and if you're firing your queries in your database or maybe executing certain triggers or procedures in your backend database from your application server, right, then you need a certain kind of a cache for the performance increase, and this is related with the same. So if you use a prepared statement or callable statement in an application, there may be processing overhead in the communication between the application server and database server. So again, every time your application is going to a database and executing the trigger, executing the procedures, executing the same query again and again, that create a certain kind of a performance problems, right? For that prepared and callable statements need to be cached in your cache size somewhere, right? So to handle this processing cost, Weblogic server can cache prepared and callable statements used by the application. So in a statement cache size, your Weblogic cache all such kind of statements to increase the performance. Now, if you're confused about what is prepared and callable statement, so very easy. So prepared statement is used to execute dynamic or parameterized SQL queries. That means if you're executing certain kind of queries where you are providing your dynamic parameters, okay, for example, name equal to question mark and then ID equal to question mark. That means you are taking certain kind of input and then you are providing in your query. So that is a parametric query. If you are using this kind of a query in your database, in your application, that it is called a prepared statement. Okay, and when you are executing certain kind of a procedures in your database with the help of your application code, that is called callable statement. So such kind of a prepared and callable statement will be cached in your statement cache size, and for that you can define the statement cache size in your data source connection pool. Okay, so if you use a prepared statement cache or callable statement in an application, then use it. That means you have to check with your developers if we really have the prepared or callable statement in our application or not. If they said yes, it is there, then you can tune this parameter. And there is certain drawbacks. You may exceed the limit of open cursors on your database server. If you will specify a big size for a cache parameter or cache size, okay, assuming that it will increase your performance in a higher way, okay, this is not true, because in that case you may get a open cursor error in your application server. Okay, because in many cases the database maintain a cursor for each open statement. That means whenever you define a statement cache prepares cache size, okay, so that equivalent to the number of connections, and your database will open the number of cursors in the backend for each statement cache size. So number of cursors is again a parameter in your database, just like your connections and session parameter, which is used to connect the number of to connect the sessions to your database. Similarly, your open cursor is a kind of a parameter in your database which is used to open a query statement. Okay, so this applies to prepared and callable statements in the statement cache. So if you cache too many statements, you may exceed the limit of open cursors on your database server. This is not good for your database. Okay, for again, if you have the limit of your connections in your database is 100 only. Okay, that means you can create only 100 number of connections to your database. And if you are defining your statement cache size as a 120, right, that again going to be you in a big trouble, either from the application side or from the database side, because you may exceed in that case the open cursor parameter of your database. Okay, for example, if we have a data source with 100 connections deployed on 2 servers, that means if I have a 2 managed server and I have targeted my data source to my both servers, and my initial, or you can say my maximum capacity is 100 connections. Okay, then, and my statement cache size is 20. That means how many open cursors I'm going to be open in my application and in my database is 100 into 2 into 20. That 2 managed servers I have, 100 is the connection capacity of connection data source which I have targeted to 2 managed servers, and 20 is the statement cache size. That means all total 4,000 number of open cursors that you are going to open. So you have to take into this consideration when you are going for statement cache size tuning. Apart from that, you have certain advanced properties for connection pool. Login delay is the number of seconds to wait before creating 2 physical connections. The default is 0. That means whenever you need more connections, and then your connection pool is going to create the new connections according to the capacity increment, there is a login delay. Okay, it will wait for certain time before creating certain number of connections. Shrinking is when you're saying that you have a certain number of connections in your pool and then it is not in use, then you should allow the shrinking of your connection pool to free up the resources of your server. Okay. Shrinking is again the same as I said, that you have to shrink when you allow shrinking with the help of parameter. When you enable the allow shrinking, then you have to define the shrink frequency as well, in how many seconds it look for the data source and then go for the shrinking. The default is 900 seconds. And another important parameter is test reserved connections. Okay, so test reserved connection is indicate the server where it has to test the connections. Okay, handing them over to the client. So whenever an client need a connection from the data source, okay, if test connection reserve is enabled, okay, then it will test the connection and return the connection to the client which is only healthy. Because it may happen that certain time in the backend, if you have a rack cluster and one of them is not responding properly due to the server is not, database is not available due to some network problems. Okay, if in that case, if this connection is test reserve connection is not healthy, or you have not enabled test reserve connections, your data source may try to get connected with the database which is not available, which is not as healthy, and then it will waste time on that one before it goes to the healthy one. Okay, so if you enable the test reserve connection parameter in the data source, then it will always hand over the good connection to your client. And inactive connection timeout is a very important parameter, and you have to think and you have to learn about lot of this parameter before you're going to tuning this one. Okay, this what exactly it does is that it only releases the inactive connections. Okay, that means if you set the inactive connection timeout, and if certain some data source connections not in use in the sense your data, it is sitting idle, and WebLogic think that okay, this is sitting idle since long time and it is not in use, then it will return it back to the connection pool. But certain time it is happened that some of the connections may work for a longer time due to long running queries or backend problems. Okay, in that case you have to define this inactive connection timeout properly, because if you have defined short inactive timeout, okay, and your query is still in the running in the process in the background, okay, then your that connection will get timeout and your session will get failed in that case. So it is a very important parameter. And before going to tuning of this parameter, I would recommend to learn my Oracle support notes, or maybe the blogs or the Oracle official documentation before going to set out for this particular parameter. Okay, and how to identify the optimum maximum pool value? You go to the WebLogic console, click on your data source, and then go to monitoring, and there you will see a parameter active connections high count. Okay, so active connection high count, it will show you the number of connections, highest number of connections that has been created since the data source was instantiated. That means since your data source is active, the number of highest connection that has been created in that particular connection pool or in that particular data source. Now in picture you can see that the active connection high count is 35. That means it has reached to the highest limits of 35 at a particular time, right? That means 35 connections were occupied at certain time in this data source. That means you have to increase the capacity of your this particular data source. तो 5 मिनट देना ना, मैं थोड़ा सा रिकॉर्ड कर दे, 5 मिनट देना यू भी थोड़ा सा चुप रहना बेटा। हाँ So here I can see that this connection pool or this data source, okay, there are two data sources that has been reached to maximum limit of 35 connections. So I have to tune these particular two data sources with optimum value. That means I have to increase by 5 or maybe by 10 or 15. Maybe I can define as a configure it as a 40, now 45 or 50 based on the connections available at my database side. Okay, and if your connection limit is reached, then you may see the exception in your log file reached maximum connection capacity of pool particular, making 0 new resources. That means your connection pool is reached to the maximum capacity. Okay, so you have to increase the capacity. Now, when we talk about active connection high count, this is we have discussed in the last slide. There's a higher number of active connections that is initiated created in your data source, right? Since the data source was instantiated. Now, active connections current count the number of connections currently in your by application. That means the number of current connections that is used in by applications will be shown in the active connections current count head. Current capacity will show you the current count of JDBC connections in the connection pool in that data source. What is the number of connections pool in my data source at a particular moment? Waiting for connection count, that means the number of connection requests waiting for a database connection. Okay, that means your application is processing something, it need a connection from the database, and then all the data source, all the connection pool in your data source are in use, and then some of the application requests are waiting for the connections that will be shown in this particular head. Okay, and when we talk about the number of connections in a cluster, that means the total number of connections can be created in a cluster that is equal to the number of managed servers into the capacity of pool. That means if I have initial capacity, if I have an initial, not initial, you can say the maximum capacity of my connection pool is 100, and I have two servers, then the total number of connections that can be created at a particular moment in my database from the WebLogic side is number of servers in the cluster into the maximum capacity, because in that case I have targeted my this particular data source to two managed servers. Okay, if it is to only one managed server, then the maximum limit will be only 100, because I have two managed servers and I have targeted my data source to two servers. Okay, that means my application server can create 200 number of connections. If that is reached, okay, that means if the connection limit is reached at the database size, not from the application side. Okay, if it is reached at the application side, then you will see the exception which I have shown in the last slide, previous slide. But in this C, you can see it is a ORA exception. That means you are getting some exception from the Oracle, which is saying the maximum number of sessions or maximum number of processes exceeded. That means you have configured a value. You have configured the maximum connection value in your data source, which is beyond the limitation of the sessions and processes parameter in your database. Okay. So in that case, you have to tune your sessions and processes parameter in your database. And if you wanted to check what is the limit of your this particular parameters, that is session and process in your database, then you can run this particular query. It will show you what is the current utilization of the sessions and processes, and what is the maximum utilization, and what is the limit of this one. And this limit you can use to tune your number of capacity that you define in your data. So thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for a few more interesting videos.